The hum of the airplane engines was a faint backdrop to the thoughts racing through Staff Sergeant Malcolm Hayes' mind. He had spent the last 12 months deployed in the arid landscapes of the Middle East, enduring the scorching heat, the long nights, and the gnawing ache of separation from his wife, Alyssa. Now, as the plane descended toward the tarmac of his home city, a wave of anticipation mingled with unease washed over him. He glanced at his phone, the screen displaying the last text he'd sent her. "Miss you more than words can say. Can't wait to see you soon." He hadn't told her the exact date of his return, deciding instead to surprise her. A romantic gesture, he thought, to rekindle the spark dulled by distance. Malcolm had always been a man of action, someone who believed in showing his love through deeds rather than words. Before his deployment, he and Alyssa had been inseparable, their laughter filling the modest home they shared in Atlanta. But as the months dragged on, their calls became shorter, her voice sometimes tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Fatigue? Hesitation? He had brushed it off as the strain of being apart. The cab ride from the airport to his neighborhood felt interminable, every traffic light an obstacle in his path. He clutched his duffel bag, the worn canvas a testament to his years of service, and stared out the window at the familiar sights of his city. The streets were the same, yet everything felt slightly different, like returning to a childhood home and noticing the cracks that weren't there before. Finally, the cab pulled up in front of his house. Malcolm stepped out, inhaling deeply as he took in the sight. The small white porch, the flower bed Alyssa had meticulously tended, and the wind chime swaying gently in the breeze. It was all just as he remembered. And yet, there was an unfamiliar car parked in the driveway. He frowned but quickly dismissed the thought. Perhaps a friend visiting Alyssa, he reasoned. After all, she had always been social, surrounding herself with a close-knit circle to combat the loneliness of his absences. Malcolm adjusted his uniform, brushed off imaginary dust, and walked up the steps. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of joy and nervousness. He imagined her face lighting up in surprise, her arms wrapping tightly around him. He knocked on the door, a firm, deliberate rap that echoed in the quiet of the evening. Footsteps approached, and then the door creaked open. There she was, Alyssa, standing in the doorway, her expression a complex blend of shock, happiness, and something else he couldn't quite decipher. Her eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Malcolm," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Surprise," he said, smiling broadly, though her hesitation sent a faint ripple of doubt through him. As she stepped aside to let him in, Malcolm's keen eyes scanned the room. The furniture was the same, but small details stood out. A new throw pillow on the couch, a faint scent of cologne that wasn't his. "Didn't think I'd be home so soon." "Huh?" he teased, trying to mask the unease beginning to creep into his chest. "No, I didn't," Alyssa replied, her voice faltering. And in that moment, as their eyes met, Malcolm felt the weight of a question he wasn't ready to ask. The door clicked shut behind Malcolm as he stepped into the living room, the warmth of familiarity battling an undercurrent of unease. He set his duffel bag down with care, the sound muffled against the hardwood floor. Alyssa lingered by the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and for the first time, Malcolm felt as though he was standing in someone else's home, not his own. "I can't believe you're here," she said, her voice layered with disbelief. "You didn't even call to say you were coming." "I wanted to surprise you," he replied, trying to sound lighthearted. "I figured seeing me in person would beat a phone call." She laughed softly, but it was a sound that lacked its usual warmth. Her gaze flickered toward the kitchen, where a faint clinking sound had Malcolm's attention snapping toward the doorway. "You have company?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain even. "No, no," she said quickly, waving a hand. "I was just cleaning up. You know how I get when I'm alone. Everything has to be perfect." Malcolm nodded but remained unconvinced. His years in the military had honed his instincts, and something about the moment felt off. The house was immaculate, as Alyssa claimed, but the air held an odd tension, like the lingering scent of a conversation he hadn't been part of. She crossed the room and hugged him tightly, and for a moment, the world seemed to right itself. Her embrace was familiar, her touch soft against the stiffness of his uniform. Yet, even in her arms, he felt the weight of something unspoken. "I missed you," he said, his voice low. "I missed you too," she replied, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. "So much." Her sincerity tugged at him, but as his eyes swept the room, they landed on a jacket draped over the back of a chair. It was a man's jacket, sleek, expensive, and unfamiliar. Malcolm stiffened. "New jacket?" he asked casually, his voice betraying none of his unease. Alyssa's gaze followed his, and her face flushed. "Oh, that's—" She hesitated, then rushed on. "It's a friend's. He left it here the other night when he stopped by to check on me." "Stopped by?" Malcolm's tone sharpened despite himself. "Yeah, just making sure I was okay while you were gone." Her explanation sounded reasonable, but her delivery wasn't. Malcolm didn't press further. Though the back of his neck prickled with the nagging sense of an answer he didn't want to uncover. They moved into the kitchen, where the remnants of an unfinished meal sat on the counter. 2 plates, 1 fork missing. Alyssa busied herself tidying up, her movements quick and deliberate, as if keeping her hands moving could distract from the atmosphere growing heavier by the second. "You've been busy," Malcolm said, his eyes scanning the details. "Yeah, I guess I have," she replied, her back to him. Silence filled the space, each second louder than the last. Finally, Alyssa turned to him, her expression a fragile mix of guilt and determination. "I didn't know you'd be home so soon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something in her tone struck Malcolm, cutting deeper than the words themselves. The air between them crackled with the weight of what remained unsaid. And for the first time, he wondered if the surprise he'd planned so carefully might unravel a truth he wasn't prepared to face. Malcolm leaned against the kitchen counter, his gaze steady on Alyssa as she fidgeted with a dish rag. The air between them felt thick, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. He could feel the weight of her unease, see it in the way her fingers trembled slightly as she wiped the spotless counter. "Alyssa," he began, his voice measured, "is there something you're not telling me?" She froze, the dish rag clenched tightly in her hand. Her shoulders tensed, and for a long moment, she didn't turn to face him. Malcolm's heart pounded, each beat a dull thud in his chest. "Why would you ask that?" she said finally, her voice a weak attempt at nonchalance. He gestured toward the living room. "The jacket, the extra plate, the way you've been acting since I walked in the door. Something's not right." Alyssa sighed and placed the rag on the counter. When she turned to him, her eyes were glassy, the kind of look that spoke of a storm barely contained. "I didn't want it to come out like this," she said softly, her voice cracking. Malcolm felt his stomach twist. He crossed his arms over his chest, bracing himself. "Come out like what?" Her hands trembled as she clasped them together. "There's someone else." The words hit him like a physical blow, the air forced from his lungs. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and he gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. "What?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan for it to happen," Alyssa continued quickly, tears streaming down her face. "I was lonely, Malcolm. You were gone for so long, and I didn't know how to handle it. He was just there." He straightened, his jaw tightening as her words sank in. "Who is he?" "His name is Jordan," she admitted, her voice barely audible. He's a colleague from work. It started as friendship, but it became something more. Malcolm turned away, his mind racing. The betrayal cut deep, sharper than he'd imagined possible. Images of their life together flashed through his mind. The vows they'd exchanged, the promises they'd made. How long, he asked, his voice cold, distant. 6 months, she confessed, her sobs growing louder. I tried to end it, but every time I didn't know how to be alone anymore. He spun to face her, anger flashing in his eyes. Alone? Alyssa, I was out there risking my life for us. For you. And you couldn't wait. Her tears fell harder, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for this to happen. I made a mistake, Malcolm. I know I did. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by Alyssa's muffled sobs. Malcolm paced, his fists clenching and unclenching. His mind was a chaotic swirl of anger, hurt, and confusion. Finally, he stopped and looked at her, his expression unreadable. Do you love him? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Alyssa shook her head vehemently. No, I don't. I love you, Malcolm. I swear I do. Her words hung there, desperate and raw. But as Malcolm met her tearful gaze, he wasn't sure if they were enough. The weight of Alyssa's words settled over the room like an oppressive fog. Malcolm stood frozen, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The love they'd once shared felt distant, a fragile memory tainted by her betrayal. Yet, beneath the anger and heartbreak, another emotion emerged, an aching need for answers. You say you love me, he said, his voice measured but sharp. But love isn't just words, Alyssa. It's actions. And your actions, he trailed off, shaking his head. I don't even know who you are anymore. She stepped toward him, her tear-streaked face a portrait of regret. I'm still me, Malcolm. I'm still the woman who loves you, who married you, who broke me, he interrupted, his voice rising. The pain was raw now, impossible to contain. Do you even understand what you've done? While I was out there, fighting to come home to you, you gave what was ours to someone else. Her hands trembled as she reached for him. But he stepped back, the distance between them a chasm neither knew how to bridge. I was weak, she admitted. I let my loneliness control me. But I'm telling you the truth now because I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Malcolm stared at her, his heart battling between love and the deep wound she'd inflicted. He closed his eyes, memories of their life together flashing through his mind. Late-night laughter, shared dreams, whispered promises. Was that love still worth saving? I don't know if I can forgive you, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. This isn't something you can just apologize for and expect to go away. I'm not expecting that, Alyssa replied quickly, desperation coloring her words. But I'm begging you for a chance. We can rebuild, Malcolm. I'll end things with Jordan. I'll go to counseling. Whatever you need, I'll do it. Her plea hung in the air, and Malcolm felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He turned away, staring out the kitchen window as the twilight deepened into night. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across their quiet neighborhood. He thought about the sacrifices he'd made for their relationship, the trust he'd placed in her, the foundation they'd built together. It wasn't perfect, but it had been real until now. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. You need to end things with him. No contact, no excuses. If you want any chance of fixing this, that's where it starts. Alyssa nodded, her relief palpable. I will. I swear. But this doesn't mean I'm staying, he added, meeting her gaze with unflinching honesty. I need time to figure out if I can still see you the same way. If we even have a future. Tears welled in her eyes again, but she didn't argue. Take all the time you need. I'll be here waiting. The room fell into silence, the tension giving way to a fragile understanding. Malcolm picked up his duffel bag and headed for the door. He paused, turning back to look at her one last time. I want to believe we can fix this, he said. But I don't know if I can. As the door closed behind him, Alyssa sank to the floor, her sobs echoing in the empty house. Outside, Malcolm stood on the porch, the night air cool against his skin. He took a deep breath, unsure of where he would go or what the future held, but certain of one thing. He needed to find himself again before he could decide if he could find his way back to her.